Today, LSD and most hallucinogens are illegal. For decades, millions in the West believed acid and similar drugs could unlock the doors of perception. Then, as one door opened, another closed.
Hallucinogenic plants seem to have always been an important part of human society, going way back to primitive cultures.
How did we go from having the most revered substances of the shamanic world become the most reviled of the modern?
This is a story of the discovery of peyote, magic mushrooms, and beyond. One man's little-known quest to classify the plants of the gods. Before hallucinogens were well known, real-life Indiana Jones, Richard Evans Schultes, searched the Americas for these mind-altering substances. He revolutionized science and spawned another revolution he never imagined. To most, LSD or psychedelics are synonymous with the 1960s and the hippie generation. But mind-altering plants and hallucinogens have been around as long as human beings and may even have sparked the early art and imaginings of our prehistoric ancestors. Had it not been for the scientific investigations of one man, peyote, magic mushrooms, and other sacred plants may have remained hidden in the shadows. Even today, little is known about them. Some scientists feel hallucinogens may hold valuable clues to the workings of our minds. You know, when I was a young student at Harvard, Richard Evans Schultes was sort of a legend on the campus, a man, a kindly professor who shot blowguns in class and had lived mysteriously in the Amazon for years, probably the greatest living explorer of the 20th century. And what really intrigued him, of course, were the curious plants that had first inspired him in his work in Oklahoma, his later work in Mexico, these curious plants that we know as the hallucinogens.
Now, the active intoxicating principle.
In late 1973, I knocked on Schultes' office door. 2 weeks later, I was in the Amazon, living amongst many of the same tribes that Schultes had visited 30 years before. As an anthropologist and botanical explorer, I shared many similar adventures, becoming lost in the forest, fending off strange diseases, and participating in sacred ceremonies. In all my years of exploration, I was always inspired by his example. Whatever he told me to do, I did, whether investigating zombies in Haiti or searching for new hallucinogens in the Amazon rainforest. I later spent years researching and writing his biography, One River. The more I learned about his exploits, the more the man amazed me. Now I'm retracing his route to witness sacred hallucinogenic rites from the American desert to the jungles of the Amazon.
Where the Mississippi River.
In the summer of 1936, a 21-year-old Harvard student left Boston and began one of the longest, strangest trips of the 20th century. His inspiration was a plant. In an obscure German book, Richard Evans Schultes had read of a small hallucinogenic cactus that could induce otherworldly visions. Its name was peyote. He was so amazed he decided to drop everything to study it. He was inspired by his professor, Oakes Ames, director of the Botanical Museum, who encouraged students in his class to sample exotic stimulants and even distilled alcohol during Prohibition years. Ames provided the money to send Schultes 1,400 miles away to Oklahoma to unravel the secrets of peyote use amongst the Kiowa Indians. Peyote grows in the American Southwest and northern Mexico. For 3,000 years, the ancient peoples of Mexico used the cactus as a direct line to God. Then the newly arrived Spaniards banned it in 1521. In the late 1800s, German scientists extracted the active ingredient, the hallucinogen mescaline. Yet even by Schultes' day, few knew of the religious use of peyote amongst Native Americans.
In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were a few non-Indians who were experimenting with it. Americans, some literary people like Weir Mitchell, William James, a philosopher. They were experimenting with peyote and describing the experiences in very interesting ways.
Where the Mississippi River.
Schulte's trip to the Kiowa was a logical choice. The tribe had been visited once before by his new traveling companion, graduate student and anthropologist Weston LeBar. This was to be an extraordinary adventure. They had a beat-up 1928 Studebaker. The trip to Oklahoma lasted days on roads so bad it sometimes took 12 hours to go 100 miles. And there was no guarantee what they'd find at the end of their journey.
And the federal government battled a nation of lawbreakers. The law of the land said it was illegal to drink.
As Schulte set out, a 14-year war against alcohol had just ended in surrender. Prohibition was repealed. But a nation that had demonized rum wasn't ready to legalize a mind-altering cactus.
Well, hallucinogenic drugs are different from other classes of drugs. For starters, hallucinogens are not addictive substances. It's not something you could take every day. It just doesn't work that way ordinarily. I mean, I can't imagine anyone who would want to. It is such a powerful experience. It takes time to integrate it.
It's not the kind of thing you're going to want to do every day. That's the huge difference between LSD, for instance, and heroin. Heroin, you can put everything off forever using heroin. You know, all that really matters is the heroin is being comfortable.
Human beings are born with an innate drive to experience other states of consciousness. Native peoples use psychedelic plants, natural hallucinogens, for very positive purposes. They use them for healing, for contacting spiritual reality, and they do this by using these plants ritually and purposefully.
Like Schulte's, my journey begins at home in the United States. I'm traveling to Navajo country to experience a ritual seldom seen by outsiders.
You know, in the 1930s, most of the world had never even heard of hallucinogenic plants outside of a small little circle of scholars. And that made it all the more incredible that this young kid from Harvard, who had never been west of Boston, decided in the summer of 1936 to travel out to Oklahoma and live amongst the Kiowa and study the ways of the peyote cult.
And it's something that, you know, I've always wanted to witness. I've always wanted to know it. And it's difficult. I mean, you just can't get access to it. And only the Native American Church is allowed to legally use peyote in a sacred context. But fortunately, the Navajos still have this practice, and they've invited me to join the sacred circle within the teepee and witness a remarkable ritual that is the essence of the peyote way.
Yeah, you know, Calvin, I'm extremely grateful that you're having us here, because for me, all my life I've wanted to witness and participate in a peyote ceremony, all my life.
Why?
And, well, because my great hero, the man who taught me everything,
Who is that?
His name was Professor Richard Evans Schultes. I've read everything he ever wrote about it, you know, and yet I've never had the opportunity to witness it. So this is a very important thing. Extremely grateful that you've made this possible.
So you haven't gone to the peyote yet?
No.
Not yet?
No.
Wood, lots of it, is needed to keep two fires going, one for the peyote ceremony later in the evening, the other for the sweat lodge. Across North America, sweats are a vital part of Indian life. Rocks are heated in a fire, and later, water will create the steam. The ritual is said to purify the individual, both physically and spiritually. And in the case of the peyote way, it prepares you for the intensity of the sacred ceremony.
We learn something in the sweat lodge too. We don't just go in there. We talk about, we teach our young generation.
Calvin Sosi is a revered elder of the Peyote Church. He's called a roadman because he guides believers down a road of righteousness, away from such vices as alcohol. The cactus is the vehicle. Richard Schultes learned about peyote from a legendary roadman, Bello Kozat, who was born at a time when buffalo still covered the plains.
When we go into the sweat, it's like going into Mother Earth. You're going into the mother's womb. Things that hurt a person, it's all inside of us, so we go in there to clean that out of us. And then when we go into ceremony, we're clean. We can still pray, and then that's when the medicine works.
It's a little bit like entering an oven, and once you're inside, it's pitch black. But then the songs begin, preparing you for the long night of peyote rituals ahead.
It's always said that temperatures in these traditional sweats can get so intense that if you don't sing, if you're not involved in the chants, you can get overwhelmed.
Sweat lodge ceremonies are sacred, and Calvin doesn't want any cameras inside.
It feels like you've had this sort of, I mean, it's great because you feel like you've had a bath and a shower by like a thundercloud or something, you know, it's like this warm rain that's come pouring down all over you, which is your own sweat. And it's funny, the juniper that came from my garden.
In 1936, Schultes experienced these rituals too, but it took time. When he first arrived, the Kiowa were cautious. They had suffered in the past for practicing their sacred ways. And now Labar was back with a stranger who wanted to understand their most solemn ceremony.
This is my colleague, Richard Schultes.
By respecting their traditions, Schultes earned the Kiowa's trust. With no hesitation, he swallowed the bitter, sacred medicine up to 4 times a week. Schultes found the kaleidoscopic colors astonishing. But even he could not escape the nauseating side effects of the cactus, seen as an essential part of the ritual. By taking the cactus, Schultes established a precedent he would follow for the rest of his career. He refused to be the clinical scientist, outside looking in. He immersed himself in native culture to learn secrets denied to outsiders.
I think from the moment that I saw him, I was fascinated by him. He had an amazing fund of knowledge. He was just an interesting person, somebody I wanted to know. I think underneath, my sense is that he was quite a wild person. I'm tempted to even say a proto-hippie who back in that era, there was really no social support for that kind of thing.
Schultes' research came at just the right time. There were still a few elders left of the very generation that had first created the peyote way. Tomorrow, I'm going to have a chance to do something I've wanted to do ever since meeting Schultes: participate in a traditional peyote ceremony. For him, that summer in Oklahoma was just the beginning of a life of exploration. He would discover sacred plants and hallucinogens so powerful, it would change a generation. Plant explorer Richard Evans Schultes was a real-life Indiana Jones whose discovery of hallucinogenic plants laid the foundation for the psychedelic 60s. His adventure began in Oklahoma in 1936, working with the Kiowa Indians to unravel the mysteries of the peyote way. For years, I studied with Schultes. Now, I'm retracing his journey, starting here at a rarely witnessed peyote ceremony, just being prepared. Peyote ceremonies are a blend of Native American and Christian beliefs. A half-moon altar is prepared, and later, glowing coals in the shape of a mythical thunderbird.
So this is a crescent altar, which once it's formed in the shape, becomes a symbol of the Peyote Road, which is a path of righteousness you must walk. And then the fire will be here, dead center, and eventually the ashes, you can almost see how the ashes will be formed into the shape of the thunderbird.
No Navajo celebration would be complete without a mutton feast. The peyote ceremony is no different. This sheep will be cooked for the next day's meal.
There's just something so wonderfully ordinary about life with all people, all times. It's just like the peyote cult. I mean, it's not, it's just so much backdrop of people's lives here. It's what you do to be well.
Here, peyote is sacred. It's never taken just to get high. In fact, tribal members trying to kick a drug habit will actually turn to peyote.
This is our traditional thing to do. But if they want help out there and they take their drugs and if they want to get out of it, so they would come into the peyote meeting and they'll get a cure for it,
They want to stop using drugs or alcohol, they can come in a meeting.
So in a way, you don't even think of this as a drug. This is a medicine. It's used to treat.
It's just helping you out, helping your mind out.
I've spent 7 years studying amongst Navajo Native Americans and other Native Americans their use of peyote, and I just completed a neuroscience study of close to 200 people in the final published study. The results show that these people are healthy.
The ritual is protected federally by an act of Congress, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, passed in 1994. Yet not all state laws conform with the federal mandate, creating confusion. So Native American church members are sometimes arrested when transporting their legal sacrament across state lines. In the 16th century, the Spanish banned peyote use, even killing Aztec priests. Yet it continued to flourish amongst the Indians of Mexico. Not until the late 1800s did the ritual start to spread to the tribes of the United States. The man who started it all was a Comanche chief of mixed blood named Quanah Parker. In 1884, badly wounded in battle, Parker received peyote to heal his wound. Then, while in a trance, Parker said Christ appeared to him and gave him a message to spread the peyote faith. It was Parker who created the half-moon altar, with peyote at the center, as a new kind of sacrament.
But its power grew out of the fact that as the traditional ways declined, as the buffalo were reduced to a shadow on the prairie, as the wisdom of the elders became just a memory, as the Sundance was forbidden, and as all the ritual practices which had made this extraordinary culture of the plains so majestic, when all that was lost, here was something that offered a new promise of hope, a vision of God, a new possibility for life itself.
Yet despite the efforts of Quanah Parker, the peyote ceremony remained illegal. The man who helped legalize the peyote way was a pioneering anthropologist named James Mooney.
This fellow James Mooney came along and encouraged the Cheyenne Arapaho Nation to incorporate as a church. We call it the Peyote Church, the Native American Church. This is a peyote way. This is a native traditional way. But this word church, to please the white missionaries, and it stuck. When Schultes came to the Kiowa, Greater White America either didn't know about peyote or they were hostile to it. And so the Americans that were in charge of reservations were trying to stamp it out. It was very much hidden, but it was also illegal.
The Native American Church was formally incorporated in 1918, with some 20,000 members spread across several states. But government opposition continued for decades. Schultes' first peyote ceremony was a revelation. The cactus was used here as a healing tool, a kind of communion wafer to bring participants closer to God. The peyote ceremony begins as it did in Schulte's day, with the words of a tribal member who is suffering. The patient, Karen, has survived a whole range of abuse. She has come to be healed.
Taking good care of him.
It's just what people do to stay well. It's what they do to make sense out of sensation, to heal themselves when they're ill, to rebalance their energy and their spirits when they feel low.
No, we can sing.
The crown of the peyote cactus is cut off and dried. The plant is extremely bitter. Some users manage to chew it. Calvin has ground it up and also prepared a tea to make it easier to take.
Then we'll go ahead and eat some medicine. Like us that we can't force nobody.
Throughout the ceremony, the participants use the peyote as a sacrament. They take as much or as little as they desire. What they must do is revere the plant. At times, the people will take small, symbolic amounts, so little that the plant has no physical effect. But when deemed necessary for healing, the roadman and the participants will consume enough to induce a powerful psychoactive experience. But that experience, as Schultes discovered, does have side effects. Beyond the powerful visions and euphoria, compounds in the cactus often induce nausea and vomiting. The roadmen believe this is the medicine's way of purging illness from the patient. As dawn breaks, the peyote starts to wear off. Calvin closes the ceremony as roadmen did in Schulte's time, with the sacred eagle fan, a final brushing off of sorrow and pain. In the early morning, the teepee comes down. Every sign of the ceremony is swept away. The final act is the cutting of the cord that ties the teepee poles together. Symbolically, and perhaps tangibly, Karen's sorrows will disappear.
It's got to work from teaching people to really understand what they're doing to their bodies and the sanctity and the holiness of their body and to protect it. And once people have an appreciation of that, maybe it's not so bizarre then for a Navajo elder to suggest to a grandson to come with him to pray to God, to their creator, with their sacrament, which they call medicine with a capital M. And that medicine, today, it's still peyote for them.
You know, that summer in Oklahoma really changed Schulte's life. He went back east, and not long after, he went down to Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and he testified at Congress in favor of the rights of Native American people to use peyote in traditional context. And while he was there, he was doing some research at the Smithsonian, and he came upon a letter that provided a clue that would allow him in time to solve one of the really great mysteries in the whole history of botany.
And Schulte's solving of that puzzle would unwittingly usher in a whole new era, a time when lifestyle and culture merge with religion and politics, a revolution that continues to affect us to this day. While in Washington, D.C. in 1937, botanist Richard Evans Schultes came across an astonishing letter in the collections of the Smithsonian Institution. In the letter, a Mexican doctor, Blas Pablo Rico, made a passing reference to a long-lost hallucinogen, Tehuacatl, flesh of the gods, used by Aztec priests to commune with their creator. Pinned to a peyote specimen, Reiko's letter stated that Tehuacatl was not peyote, as commonly believed, but was a mushroom still used by Indians in the mountains of Oaxaca. Schultes believed Reiko and then convinced his Professor Ames to fund his journey to Mexico to search for the true identity of the Aztec plant. I've come down here to follow the trail of the mystery. The letter from Reiko really was the key to the puzzle, because it suggested not only that Tehuacatl really was a mushroom, but that the mushrooms were still being used in ceremonies in remote reaches of Mexico. Schultes contacted Reiko, who sent him samples of the mushrooms in 1937, but the specimens arrived in such terrible shape that they couldn't be scientifically identified. So Schultes decided himself to travel to Mexico, really with the goal of finding the mushrooms' growings, if they existed, so that he'd be able to collect proper specimens that would allow him to identify at last this mysterious sacred plant of the Aztec. So he came south by Greyhound bus to Mexico, met up with Reiko, and they traveled by train south into the mountains of Oaxaca, and eventually by horseback to reach the small Mazatec community of Huatla. We're leaving Oaxaca City by road, traveling 200 miles inland to Huautla, where curanderas, female shaman, still practice their sacred rites, transporting patients into supernatural realms using magic mushrooms, a term that in 1938 had not been invented yet. It's hard when you come into a country as we did to realize and imagine what it was like in the time of Schultes. He had to take a broken down railroad south from Mexico City, get off at a random railhead in some small town, hire a mule, and come up 14-15 hours overland to get to a very small village nestled in the mountains in the mist. What he found was a unique cultural universe, which was the Mazatec world. The Mazatec Indians live throughout the mountains of Oaxaca. Huautla de Jimenez is one of their larger towns. You know, it's both strange and wonderful to be here in Huautla, and I have such an image of the place in my head from all the photographs that Schultes took. It's incredible to think about him in 1938. He came up this very street, then it was just a simple cobblestone track flanked by Mazatec homes on either side. And to his astonishment, he discovered that his companion, Reiko, who had first turned him on to the idea of these curious mushrooms, was an ardent Nazi sympathizer. Now, this is a year before Europe is about to drop into the Second World War. And to make things even more incredible, there was another team of scholars led by Bernard Bevan and Robert Wheatlander, and it turned out that Bevan, at least by rumor, was British Secret Service. So you had the scenario right out of Indiana Jones of these two teams of scholars converging on this small Mazatec village in search of the mystery of the sacred mushrooms. So with Reiko's help, Schultes searched the village for people who might know of this hallucinogenic mushroom. He needed a complete specimen to scientifically classify this living flesh of the gods. I'm trying to track down a well-known curandera with the hope she'll let me witness a shamanic mushroom ceremony. ¿La señora es por allá? The shamanic path is not for everybody. It's the individual who is touched by the divine, who has a special calling, who is the one who becomes the intermediary between the realm of the mundane, the realm of the ordinary, and the realm of the spirits. Like all curanderas, Inés calls the mushrooms the little gods. Inés said that when I asked her what was the significance of the mushrooms, she said that, you know, we call them the little gods for a reason, that they in fact are, in a sense, little gods of the Mazatec. Even though they are hallucinogenic, they are in no way a drug. They are something that's used to cure, and to cure not only
problems of the body, but any kind of problem. The mushroom itself is a vehicle to another realm where good things can happen.
Ines is taking me on a hunt for the little gods. The Mazatec idea of the mushrooms is a total fusion of pre-Columbian ideas and Catholic ideas. The belief isn't that the mushrooms simply grow from the ground. They only grow where the blood of Christ fell onto the ground or where the saliva of Christ fell onto the ground. You know, Schultes used to say that the missionaries complained to him about how difficult it was to explain to the Mazatec what Holy Communion was, because the Mazatec would say, we already do that. We already eat the body of Christ. So when you took the mushrooms, you were engaged and taken into your body, not only sort of the Mazatec tradition, but also quite literally the body of Christ. In 1938, Schultes and Reiko spent weeks searching for the identity of the Mazatec mushroom. Meanwhile, Robert Wheatlander and the other team of scholars sat in on one of the secret ceremonies and reported a special mushroom being consumed, but an actual specimen eluded both parties. Word was put out to locals, and one day, an Indian showed up with a selection of freshly picked mushrooms. Schultes recognized one of them from Reiko's earlier dried specimens. This was it, Tehuantecatl, the flesh of the gods. Schultes was the first to collect a voucher specimen of this hallucinogen and scientifically identify it. 15 years later, inspired by Schultes' work, an investment banker and vice president of J.P. Morgan would venture down here. What he found would start a revolution. High in the mountains of Oaxaca in 1938, Richard Evans Schultes had identified an ancient Aztec hallucinogen. Tehuantecatl, the flesh of the gods, turned out indeed to be a mushroom. What's more, it was still being used in secret ceremonies by contemporary Indians. The hallucinogen was traditionally eaten at royal Aztec feasts, sometimes following human sacrifice. Priests also used them to diagnose illness. Banned for centuries by the Spanish, Tehuantecatl rituals went underground, only to re-emerge as a combination of Christian and pre-Columbian beliefs. Schultes always said that if you were to know the ways of the shaman, you had to participate in all of their rituals. Tonight, I'll take part in a ceremony seldom experienced by outsiders, a journey inside the mind, guided by Ines, a remarkable healer. Years ago, she witnessed a mushroom ceremony for an Englishman. His name was John Lennon. One of these boys suffers from unexplained pain. His mother has brought him here to be doctored. Both Ines and the boy will take the mushrooms. Like the ancient Aztec, the curandera believes that the mushrooms allow her to diagnose illness. First, all the participants are purified with incense and medicinal leaves.
Fascinating thing about the ceremony is just the symbolism of it all. You know, the lights, the purity, the flowers, the smoke, the copal, taking the prayers to heaven.
Now, the journey really begins. Ines sings to help guide participants on their journey.
She has learned her art of healing, her art of ritual, not from a book, not even from another person or another curandera, but actually from the mushroom itself. The mushroom is the teacher.
Ines applies a final symbolic dusting of sacred tobacco powder to protect me during the ceremony. For as long as people have taken the mushrooms, they have reported profound sensations. Some feel the presence of God, others feel reborn. The mushroom's active ingredient is psilocybin, a substance similar to chemicals that control certain brain functions, including how we perceive the world. The compound is similar enough that when humans take the mushroom, its chemicals co-opt our own. The result? An altered state of perception.
Walter Pankey at MIT did this famous Good Friday experiment with psilocybin, showing that in this kind of research setting that there was the potential to cause mystical experience. And there was very recently a study from Johns Hopkins that interestingly made front page news around the world about psilocybin having the potential to induce mystical experiences.
It's the morning after the ceremony. Throughout Huautla, curanderas have been taking dozens of seekers on similar journeys through the night.
It's always a remarkable experience and a fantastic opportunity to be able to go through a ritual ceremony as I did last night. Schultes, of course, when he came here, was able to identify the mushroom, but he did not have the opportunity to actually take the mushroom in sacred context, in part because Reiko advised him that it was simply too secret, too sacred, impossible to penetrate.
In 1938, while Schultes looked for the mushrooms, Swiss scientist Albert Hofmann conducted tests on another curious substance, an unusual fungus that grew on rye grain. Ergot had been known since the Middle Ages, when it was used by midwives to control bleeding in childbirth. Bread contaminated by ergot was responsible for outbreaks of mass hallucinations, hysteria, and sometimes death. Working with a potent extract of ergot, Hofmann synthesized a compound he called lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. Then he forgot about it, until 5 years later.
He was working as a research scientist for Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company. In 1943, he looked through his notebook, found this compound, thought it might be interesting, took it, had some of it, and while working with it, started to feel strange.
A very strange experience which reminded me to some experience I had in childhood. The feeling of oneness, to be one with nature, the feeling to see now the true aspects of nature.
And he reasoned that he must have absorbed some of it through his skin. So the next day he took deliberately what he thought would be a minuscule dose.
A truly minuscule dose is between 100 and 500 micrograms, about 1/10 the mass of a grain of sand.
But this very small dose, the first dose of my experiments I planned, was very, very strong.
It turned out to be a huge dose because at that time nobody knew that a drug could work in microgram amounts. And he realized quickly that he was having a very strong reaction, so he rode his bicycle home, and he's given us quite an account of that bicycle trip.
Last Friday, April 16th, 1943, I was forced to interrupt my work in the laboratory in the middle of the afternoon and to proceed home. Being affected by a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. At home, the visions grew with nightmarish feverish intensity. For a moment, Hoffman thought that he might be dying.
And the object like this chair was like if he was a living object. It became moving from inside.
Ganz langsam ging der Horrortrip in eine wunderbare Triebhöhe. Plötzlich hatte ich das Gefühl, es kommt ein neues Leben in mich hinein.
And he had the first recorded LSD experience. I think he found that quite engaging rather than scary. And shortly afterwards, he introduced the LSD experience to the president and the chairman of the board at Sandoz. One of them had a very positive experience, one a very negative. And I think that's LSD in a nutshell, that it has both of those faces. For a number of years, the man who had the positive experience was in charge of Sandoz policy, and during that time the company sent samples of LSD to researchers around the world, and that really was the way that the psychedelic experience got introduced to our modern world.
Through serendipity and the clever manipulation of the ergot molecules, Hoffman had stumbled on the most potent synthetic hallucinogen. He went down in history as the father of LSD. But back in Mexico in the 1930s, Schulte's work wasn't quite finished. In 1939, he convinced Oakes Ames to fund him once more to pursue the other great Aztec mystery, the sacred hallucinogen Ololuiki, the serpent vine. It had been described in the early Spanish texts, yet there was disagreement in academic circles as to its true identity.
A Mexican botanist had suggested that it could be a morning glory. Others had disagreed, but Schultes was able to indeed confirm that there were in fact two different species of morning glories, very closely related to your common garden variety, that were used as sacred hallucinogenic plants by the peoples of Mexico. About 12 years later, Gordon Wasson was able to collect seeds of Ololuiki and send them to Dr. Albert Hofmann in his lab in Switzerland, and Hofmann was able to find out what the chemicals were that were responsible for the power of the plant. What Hofmann found was really extraordinary because it turned out that the key chemical constituents of the serpent vine were indole alkaloids nearly identical to LSD, which meant in effect that 4 years before Hofmann synthesized LSD in the laboratory, Schultes had found its counterpart in nature, in the seeds of a humble morning glory, long worshipped as a god incarnate by the ancient peoples of Mexico.
Beginning in 1939, Schultes published several papers about his magical discoveries in Oaxaca. Few read them. More than a decade later, English writer and mythologist Robert Graves saw Schultes' article in the Sacred Mushrooms in an anthropological journal. Graves sent the article to a friend and mushroom scholar, New York banker Gordon Wasson. Inspired by Schultes, Wasson journeyed to Huautla to seek a curandera named Maria Sabina with a hope that she would let him into the secret ceremony. After 3 expeditions, he finally gained her trust and became the first Westerner to ingest the flesh of the gods in a Mazatec ceremony. Wasson's photographer, Alan Richardson, documented the ritual. Unknown to Wasson, his field trips were being monitored by the CIA. When Wasson returned to Oaxaca, the agency planted a spy, posing as a scientist on the expedition, to bring back the mushrooms for testing.
The CIA thought that here was a drug that had anxiety built into it, that you give it to a person and make them so anxious they'd freak out, and then they'd be vulnerable to manipulation by a spy, by the U.S. spy.
By then, scientists and spies weren't the only ones in on the secret.
It was really not until Wasson published the Life magazine article in 1957 that it really blew open, because he made the connection with shamanism, with the archaic world. And he grounded it in something other than the paranoid fantasies of the CIA.
Wasson's Life magazine article was a watershed. An editor attached the snappy title, Seeking the Magic Mushrooms, and opened a new door of perception for a whole generation. By age 26, Schultes had made enough discoveries for a lifetime. But he was just getting started. His longest odyssey lay just ahead in the Amazon. And little did he know, the seeds of the psychedelic revolution had now been sown. In 1939, with World War II underway in Europe, Richard Evans Schultes' pioneering work on a hallucinogenic cactus and a magic mushroom did little to catapult him into stardom. What the war did promise were thousands of wounded soldiers, and they would need surgery. Medical science was on the hunt for ways of improving surgical anesthesia. In 1941, Schultes received a grant from the U.S. National Research Council. His assignment? Travel to South America to identify the botanical source of curare poison. He entered the land of the Kofan Indians, the most notorious poison makers in the northwest Amazon. Here, among the Kofan, he also came upon the most powerful hallucinogen found in nature. I've come thousands of miles south to the Ecuadorian Amazon to continue my journey retracing my professor's explorations as he pursued the secrets of the Amazonian vision vine. "60 years ago, this territory was untouched forest. Today, I've got to pass through this seedy Ecuadorian border town, perched on the dangerous Colombian frontier, to reach the descendants of the Kofan Indians that Schultes met. I first came here in the mid-70s, and it's changed a lot."
Well, the amazing thing is that this entire place has grown up since oil was discovered. And even in 1974, it was one single mud strip, a couple of hotels, a couple of whorehouses, and you know, it happened to sit on top of the biggest pool of oil ever discovered in Ecuador, probably in South America. And the Kofan just had the misfortune to be the owners of that land under which oil was found.
From this landing, I've got a 9-hour river trip ahead of me to get to the Kofan Indian village.
You know, when Schultes finished his work in Mexico, he had 2 job offers after he got his PhD. He could have gone and become a school teacher at a private school in New England, or he could have gone to the Amazon to search for the mystery of a plant known as the flying death. Fortunately for science, he chose the Amazon.
To reach the Kofan, Schultes traveled for weeks, first through Colombia on foot, over the Andes, and then by boat, down one river, then up the Sucumbíos River into the land of the poison makers. In the 16th century, explorers like Sir Walter Raleigh were amazed by the blowgun. Darts dipped in plant poisons that could kill silently from a distance. Terrified Europeans dubbed it the Flying Death. Raleigh described its horrifying consequences. Victims of the poison suffer an ugly and lamentable death, sometimes dying stark mad. The poison was curare, a mixture of plants. Since its discovery by the Spanish in the 16th century, scientists have been fascinated by its paralyzing properties and its medical potential. Small samples would find their way out of the jungle, but no one knew their source. Then, in the 1930s, scientists discovered that curare was a powerful muscle relaxant that had the promise of transforming modern surgery. Schultes' hunt began in 1941. Other explorers who had entered this region of the Amazon had returned with lurid and fantastic tales of terrible diseases and even cannibals. It was one of the last unknown places on the planet. The area Schultes explored was the size of Western Europe. Months passed with no contact with the outside world. He survived treacherous rapids, encounters with wild animals, near fatal plane crashes, and suffered from any number of tropical diseases. He traveled light, with a single change of clothes, a pith helmet, a hammock, a camera, plant collecting gear, snakebite serum, a machete, and his beloved LL Bean moccasins. He never carried a gun. He was the first outsider some tribes had ever seen. "I do not believe in hostile Indians," Schultes once wrote. "All that is required to bring out their gentlemanliness is reciprocal gentlemanliness."
Schultes is the big figure of the 20th century, an inspiration to outside of ethnobotany, to anthropologists. You know, he went and took the Indians seriously in the 1940s and 50s and listened to them and swallowed their plants when they said he should and learned from them. And in a world of racism and prejudice where everybody thought Indians were a bunch of losers and Stone Age obstacles to progress, he realized that they were a path to knowledge.
When I was doing my researches in Colombia in the 1970s, I was told by a Colombian botanist that if I ever had difficulties out in the jungle or anywhere, that if I just mentioned Schultes' name and said I was associated with him, he said it would just open doors. He said, down here, Schultes es Dios, Schultes is God.
"9 hours downriver from the end of the road, we're approaching the Kofan village, the same tribe Schultes visited in 1941. I'm dropping in on an old friend, Randy Borman. Randy's parents were missionaries, and he was raised from birth in the forest and grew up as a Kofan, speaking the language and learning the ways of the elders."
You know, it's incredible. When Schultes came, you got a sense that it was a very remote place, you know. Incredible.
Randy and I are tracking down some of the same magical plants that Schultes sought. Those discoveries would lead him to a new kind of hallucinogen, the most powerful found in nature. In 1942, ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, working for the U.S. National Research Council, came to the Amazon to seek the botanical sources of curare. It was believed that this poison could be used as an effective supplement to modern anesthesia. Today, my friend Randy Borman is taking me to a part of the forest where the Kofan still gather the plants that yield the toxin.
The actual compounds are created by the plants in order to protect themselves from predation in this kind of orgy of life that is the Amazon rainforest. So D-tubercularium, from an evolutionary point of view, was created by the plant to protect itself from insect predation. And of course, that's what the indigenous people have been exploiting for so many thousands of years.
Blowguns, 8 feet in length, combined with poison-tipped darts, are used to take down animals as small as a hummingbird or as big as a tapir. Occasionally, they've proven deadly on humans during times of tribal wars.
This is condodendron, which is the main ingredient of the arrow poison. I mean, this is condodendron tomentosum, ¿no es cierto? And this is the classic flying death. This is the arrow poison, the foundation of all the major arrow poisons in the northwest Amazon.
Getting the liana takes work. These vines grow more than 40 feet from the forest floor.
You can chew on the bark of curare without it doing any damage. It's incredibly bitter, but obviously it's not going to kill you because it hasn't been concentrated. I mean, that's the whole thing about these plants that we're seeing in the forest. The Indian people have learned to find ways to concentrate the poison inside this bark to a level of intensity that actually allows you to kill.
Richard Evan Schultes discovered that the Kofan were sophisticated pharmacists, manipulating and combining plants with incredible dexterity and genius. His discoveries of more than a dozen curare ingredients added to the knowledge of the toxin, soon to be a standard addition to modern surgical anesthesia.
All of these different admixtures that are put into it are what made the Kofan poison especially potent. Now, there's at least 15 different separate species that form part of the Kofan curare, the Kofan blowgun poison. The Kofan blowgun poison was then known throughout the whole region as the superior concoction.
From the point of view of the Kofan, you go out into this extraordinary forest, you find all these different toxic plants, and you learn to combine them in ways that create powerful effects. It's just such an extraordinary level of genius. It's just unparalleled.
Curare was just the beginning. The Kofan used plants to stun fish, heal the sick, and above all, alter perception. Their sacred hallucinogen, ayahuasca, or yahe, was a potion so sophisticated in its preparation that it would astonish the scientific world. First reported in 1851 by Schultes' great hero, the legendary plant explorer Richard Spruce, the exact ingredients and the ritual remained a mystery. Schultes learned that for the Kofan, yahe has always been a path to discovery.
In the sense that the Western world uses, they're not hallucinogens or stimulants or any of these other things. For instance, for a Kofan, it's no surprise whatsoever when they look through a microscope and all of a sudden find a complete new world down there on the microscope slide. Because they knew it all the time. They knew that there were all these dimensions, all sorts of things that you can't see around you. The microscope is seen very much in the same way as yahe is seen. It's a means to be able to get to where you can see what's going on down there.
What Schultes found was extraordinary. A hallucinogen that seemed to tap into the very synapses of the brain, made possible by the Kofan's uncanny knowledge of plant chemistry. On the verge of unraveling the mysteries of ayahuasca and the ways of the shaman, Schultes' life was catapulted in a totally different direction. In 1942, war raged in the Pacific, and the Japanese swept across Southeast Asia, taking control of 95% of the world's domestic rubber supply. The Allies desperately needed alternative sources, and the best place to go was the Amazon, where the rubber tree was native. Richard Evan Schultes was called back to Washington, D.C. At a meeting at the Department of Agriculture in November of 1942, he learned that supplies of natural rubber, essential for jeeps, tanks, ships, and planes, were dangerously low. There were no synthetic sources, and the war demanded that America alone produce 1 million metric tons of rubber every year. President Roosevelt ordered U.S. scientists to begin scouring the Americas for supplies of any and all latex-bearing plants. Schultes' new Amazon assignment helped save the country by finding new sources of latex and blight-free, fast-growing rubber trees. His work on ayahuasca, the sacred hallucinogen, would have to wait. Randy and the Kofan are leading me to a place in the forest where ayahuasca can be found.
You take it in your mouth, it tastes a little bitter, but so many other plants of the forest do. And so what were the clues? What allowed them to know, however many hundreds or even thousands of years ago, that you could take this, woody vine of the forest, combine it with this shrub, which is just, again, doesn't look like anything out of the ordinary. And yet inside the plants are these remarkable chemicals that, when combined in this unique way, create a kind of powerful synergistic effect, almost a sense of the biochemical version of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And it's really one of the great mysteries of all of ethnobotany, of all of the science of plants in the Amazon. We know, of course, how the chemicals interact. What we don't know is how the people first made this extraordinary discovery.
Schultes collected thousands of plants from the Amazon. Like ayahuasca, many were used by shamans to cure illness.
Shamanism is natural product chemistry. Shamans are not priests. They're scientists or natural philosophers in the original sense of the term. And they were always looking for the active principles of plants and trying to get concentrated activity.
I do think that there are many things that shamans do that could be very useful for doctors in our society to do. I think shamans are really masters of the psychological realm and the whole area of what I'd call the art of medicine, of like knowing how to take a patient's projection of belief onto you and reflect it back in a way that increases the possibility of healing.
So this is the other admixture, or the other plant that's added to the preparation. Remembering always that ayahuasca is not a plant, it's a combination of plants. This is known scientifically as Psychotria viridis. It's in the coffee family. You can tell by the opposite leaves, and if you look at the little fruit, it looks a little bit like a coffee bean. And yet again, you look in the forest, would this stand out as any other plant? Not particularly. What happens if you eat it, A little bitter, but no more so than this one. Nothing that you would say that, if you just took this, that you would somehow know that this had some real magic within it. I could eat as many of these leaves as I could get off this branch, and nothing would happen to me. Because the chemical that's found within this is denatured by an enzyme found naturally in the human stomach.
But combine the leaves with this vine, and you neutralize the stomach enzyme. It's this combination that produces the astonishing hallucinogenic effects. Chemicals found in ayahuasca resemble those used in modern antidepressants such as Prozac. And they've been tested in clinical trials to treat Parkinson's disease. They may have other properties still not fully understood by science. But it was tales of the wild visions that brought beat writer William Burroughs, who had studied anthropology at Harvard, down to Colombia in 1953 in search of ayahuasca. When he went to his first jungle town, he got rolled, robbed, beaten up, and jailed. The writer, most famous for counterculture books like The Naked Lunch, decided he'd better look up Richard Evans Schultes in Bogota to help him find a safer route to the sacred hallucinogen. When Burroughs finally took ayahuasca, he was terrified.
And when someone like William Burroughs came looking for just another kick and got scared out of his mind, this whole, Yahe is not for the faint-hearted. It's not really supposed to be pleasant. It was never supposed to be a pleasant thing. You're facing down some force.
For those embarking on the ayahuasca experience, there's always a sense of trepidation, of fear. The Kofan speak of facing down the jaguar. One who knew this path was Richard Evans Schultes. In an era before psychedelics, he was the first outsider to walk with the shaman and provide a glimpse into a hidden world known only to these forest peoples. By the end of World War II, in 1945, pressure was off Richard Evans Schultes. But rubber remained of strategic importance, and the U.S. government continued to fund his work in the Amazon. By the 1950s, the seeds of his hallucinogenic discoveries were beginning to sprout, but in ways he never envisioned. In 1953, beat writer William Burroughs wrote his friend, the poet Allen Ginsberg, about his recent expedition with Schultes and the sampling of ayahuasca. Their correspondence was published as the Yahe Letters, and along with his other books, helped forge the framework of the psychedelic era. That same year, a British psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, researching schizophrenia, sprinkled some mescaline crystals into the glass of a willing Aldous Huxley, the best-selling author of Brave New World. Huxley documented his fantastic visions in another book, The Doors of Perception. Osmond coined the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting. Huxley's book became a manifesto of the era.
I think it would be extremely good for almost anybody with fixed ideas and with a great certainty about what's what, to take this thing and to realize that the world he has constructed is by no means the only world, that there are these extraordinary other types of universe which we may inhabit and which we should be very grateful for inhabiting, I think.
In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, America settled into the staid and comfortable 1950s. But soon, life would be all shook up. First by rock and roll, then by a 39-year-old assistant professor at Harvard.
You'd consider me to be an eccentric.
Suddenly, hallucinogenic drugs slipped out of the hands of jungle shaman and into the minds of the masses.
You didn't have to do that in the 1960s. You didn't have to travel all the way to another continent and trek through the jungle and sit through a ritual for many hours and get sick and vomit to have this experience. You know, it was much easier if down on the street corner somebody you knew at a school or university was selling these tiny little pills that would provide essentially the same kind of experience. That was LSD, of course. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's a level of reality which is invisible to the naked eye, but which has a...
Hoffman's LSD was still legal. So was the mushroom-based psilocybin. Timothy Leary began testing both on Harvard students, following in the footsteps of researcher Humphrey Osmond, who successfully treated alcoholics with hallucinogens in England in the 1950s.
The effect is somewhat like looking through a microscope. Suddenly, when you look through a microscope, you discover that there's an invisible world around you that you hadn't known about before you did it. The same thing is true of the psychedelic drug.
I met Leary in the fall of 1960 and then knew him, and also I was the investigative reporter for the Harvard newspaper that did most of the writing about the what became the drug scandal at Harvard involving Leary.
Initially, the testing continued at Harvard unopposed, and by 1961, Leary and his colleagues left campus to test the drugs on prison inmate volunteers.
We gave psilocybin to prisoners with the hope that they would get some self-understanding and be able to lower the recidivism rate. Because that was the behavioral index, you see, of consciousness change. Some psychoanalysts would say, well, that's insane. You're going to give this drug to these guys who are murderers and rapists and thugs and whatnot, and you're going to release their unconscious, right? You're taking your life into your hand. It was totally ridiculous. There was never a single moment of violence in the prisons.
Early results looked promising. Fewer inmates seemed to return to prison. But later analysis showed outside factors like counseling had skewed the result. Recidivism hadn't changed. Leary continued to test LSD and psilocybin on student volunteers until 1962, when his methods began to veer from the scientific to the mystical. The study came to an end.
There was contention with the university about whether he could use undergraduates as research subjects. This was a huge story. It eventually became front page news on the New York Times when when Leary had left Harvard and Albert was fired. The explosion around that, I think, was really what sent the psychedelic culture into the mainstream in the U.S. And many people, in North America probably, many people had never heard of these drugs.
Leary set up a center for studying LSD and other hallucinogens at Millbrook Mansion, a New York estate donated by the heirs of the Mellon fortune.
Any religious group just beginning.
Tim Leary had a trust in democracy, and he thought that if you popularize these drugs, if you broadcast the message, that there were going to be many people who were going to get it. There were going to be a lot of people who didn't get it, who were going to lose their way. He knew that. It was a big social experiment.
LSD didn't reach the street overnight. It had made its own long, strange journey, from the Swiss lab of Albert Hofmann to various English and American psychiatric institutes for testing, and even into the hands of the CIA.
So you had the CIA on the one hand, very, very interested in not just LSD, but a bunch of different hallucinogenic drugs. You had the Beats at the same time experimenting. You had psychiatrists and therapists looking at it, ways to understand mental illness better. All these different elements ended up mixing together and setting the stage for the 1960s.
A far cry from the sacred ways unveiled by Richard Evans Schultes in the Amazon. In the 1960s, Schultes disapproved of the wholesale release of hallucinogens to the public, knowing that most often they would not have a shaman to guide them through the visionary world, with potentially negative results. The shaman blesses the ayahuasca potion to be consumed by the Kofan in the sacred enclosure.
You know, it's amazing to think that these two plants that we found in the forest 8 hours ago have been cooked all day, prepared all day, and will, in the end, launch the Kofan on a kind of journey to this extraordinary realm. You know, one of Schultes' greatest friends was the Colombian anthropologist Geraldo Rico-Domatov, and he said that to drink Yahe was to return to the cosmic uterus and be reborn.
The ayahuasca ceremony is both social event and healing ritual. The shaman takes the medicine with the patient in order to enter the realm where he can stalk disease. Ayahuasca is as complex as the human mind. The novice participant, guided by the shaman, travels through a hidden world of sometimes frightening visions. For the apprentice, the potion is used as a tool to move through stages of shamanic power, such as conquering and taking on the spirit of animals. Randy Borman understands his process.
Once you're to the point where you're actually seeing past just the bright colors and the loud sounds, and actually beginning to see the forest people or the animals or whatever like that, then you go to the next stage, which is to actually be able to interact with those. With shamanistic help, you go into the room that has all the jaguar skins in it. If you're able to get to the point where you can actually reach out and grab that with your spirit persona and clothe yourself in that, then you're on your way to becoming a jaguar shaman and actually being able to control the jaguar and actually shape change into the jaguar.
In stark contrast to the traders and adventurers before him, Schultes developed a mutual respect with the Kofan. He took their medicines to better understand the people and their plants. More than anyone else, Schultes brought this hallucinogen to the attention of the outside world. Used today by religious groups in Brazil and America, the full medical potential of ayahuasca remains unknown. Schulte's search for new species of plants took him deeper and deeper into the rainforest. In his first dozen years in the Amazon, Schultes narrowly survived a host of accidents, injuries, and jungle diseases. Then, on a trip up Brazil's Rio Negro, Schultes found himself in the remotest part of the Amazon, on the very edge of death. Throughout the 1950s, Richard Evans Schultes continued his work on developing hardy, blight-resistant strains of rubber trees for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But he never stopped looking for new species of plants, including hallucinogens. Meanwhile, in the United States, by the mid-1960s, Albert Hofmann's LSD genie was well out of its bottle, creating a hallucinogenic revolution that Schultes never endorsed.
Back in the mid-60s, when LSD first came to the fore, people were taking it quietly, individually, for the purposes of introspection. And that is simply not what we were up to. We were taking it in groups, and it was basically a sort of a party situation, but there was, I don't want to say a serious component to it, but there was a forward thrust to it. We were looking to basically to find new levels of communal experience.
Soon, psychedelia was everywhere. Millions of Americans took LSD. And as it grew worldwide, it impacted everything from fashion to the composition of music. Among those who helped LSD go mainstream, the CIA.
It's kind of an interesting phenomenon because every drug that became popular on the street as an illegal substance, a black market substance, in the 1960s and then thereafter, had been previously tested, scrutinized, in some cases even developed by the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. military. I'm talking about marijuana, mescaline, LSD, nitrous oxide, cocaine, heroin, magic mushrooms, the whole gamut of so-called recreational drugs. So it's kind of ironic that here you had in the 1950s the CIA and the Army studying these drugs to develop weapons, and that later on those same drugs were being embraced not as weapons, just the opposite, as a form of recreation, or maybe it's a form of insight.
At the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital near San Francisco, the CIA financed a study named MK Ultra on the effects of psychoactive drugs. Among the guinea pigs was a promising young writer, Ken Kesey. Out of his experience came a 1962 bestseller, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Kesey became a celebrity. While LSD was still legal, he formed the Merry Pranksters, a freewheeling group of beats and hippies who held parties where guests could experiment with the drug. Entertaining the guests was a band of young musicians called the Warlocks, soon to become better known as the Grateful Dead.
We started taking LSD every Saturday night with the Kesey crew and having these big parties that were called the acid tests. And the idea was just to see where it was going to take us. And we started discovering stuff, you know, I guess psychic links or splices we used to call them. I think in more classical terms, I think it was active Gestalt linkage, basic telepathy. And what we discovered is that this stuff is happening all the time. It's just that it gets a little faster and more furious when you remove the barriers that you erect as a child.
With the advent of acid, we discovered a new way to think. And it had to do with piecing together new thoughts in your mind that produced people like
Bob Dylan and John Lennon and William S. Burroughs, that were using new images together in a way that jarred the mind and produced images that were latent in our consciousness, but were not being brought about by reading Vanity Fair or Woman's Home Companion.
The morning after the ayahuasca, or the yahe ceremony, you can only be astonished by how brilliantly the Kofan manipulate these plants to explore states of mind most people will never experience. You know, the Amazon's an amazing, but it's a formidable place, and you never really sense its power until you're completely exposed to it. And it makes so much sense to me that yahe is this sort of plant that results in this cascade of emotions and of power and this serpentine sense of this other series of realms that just cascade over your imagination and really surround you and almost drown you with the intensity. And I've often joked that, you know, people who say they love the Amazon either haven't been here or they're liars. And the amazing thing about Schultes is that he really was a guy who liked the Amazon. He lived for it. And he came to understand every aspect of it, not only the plants, but the life ways of the people, the way of the animals. And he became, in a sense, a child of this forest. Even a child of the forest can be abandoned by its mother. On a journey up Brazil's Rio Negro in 1947, Schultes' luck finally ran out. He noticed a tingling sensation in his fingertips. Perhaps, he thought, it was the formaldehyde used to preserve his specimens. But after a few days, it had moved to his toes. It was beriberi, a dreaded tropical disease caused by a vitamin deficiency. 1,000 miles from the nearest city, with no more than a few cans of beans in his pack, Schultes now risked total paralysis and death. His only chance for survival, a huge dose of thiamine, vitamin B12, and Schultes was a very long way from a pharmacy. Racked with beriberi, plant explorer Richard Evans Schultes found himself in the most dangerous situation of his life. He was beginning to lose feeling in his extremities and was doomed unless he got the medication he needed, located hundreds of miles away in the city of Manaus. He headed for the nearest outpost, where a missionary suggested a shortcut to a military airfield for a quick flight out. The shortcut turned into a grueling month. Schultes' feet grew completely numb. He could walk only with the aid of 2 sticks. He encountered a group of nomadic Indians who invited him to join them in a hallucinogenic ceremony. The next morning, his mind still reeling with visions, Schultes searched for the sacred plant. On the brink of death, he had discovered not only a new species, but a new hallucinogen that had never before been reported by science. But his ordeal had just begun. He had no food. In treacherous rapids, his canoe capsized, dumping all of his remaining supplies and specimens into the river. When he reached the military outpost, he discovered that there were no planes. He turned around and headed back downriver. After a month of travel, he finally reached the port of Manaus. There he got his life-saving thiamine injections. And he rested for only 3 days before heading back into the jungle. 20 years later, the quiet world of discovery that Schultes enjoyed in the Amazon had exploded with a global embrace and celebration of psychedelics.
My sense is that there are really no good or bad drugs, that all drugs have the potential for constructive use and destructive use. And a challenge for human beings is when you find these powerful substances in nature, you have to find ways of using them to contain their destructive potential.
By the 1967 Summer of Love,
Globe-trotting botanist Richard Evans Schultes was a tenured professor at Harvard. Students discovered his obscure papers on the hallucinogen ololuiki and set off a rush on morning glory seeds. They lined up outside his office for a glimpse of the psychedelic pioneer.
Marijuana is the most variable.
The psychedelic era was the unwanted child of Schultes. You know, he never thought of himself as an advocate of recreational drug use. In fact, he was always publicly against it. He was one of that cadre, one of that generation of scholars and seekers whose interpretation of the use of these magic plants was unfiltered by this kind of the miasma of the 60s. You know, these were these remarkable individuals, Huxley, Gordon Wasson, Albert Hoffman, Schultes, Weston LaBarre, who were simply drawn to the inherent interest they had in these remarkable and curious plants.
In the 60s, hundreds of outsiders overran the quiet Mexican village where Schultes and Wasson had searched for the magic mushrooms. The curandera, Maria Sabina, became a reluctant celebrity. She disapproved of her idolizers, who brought other drugs to Huautla and sometimes used the mushrooms in frivolous ways. Stories began emerging about bad LSD trips, people jumping off rooftops thinking they could fly. By 1967, LSD was illegal, and Timothy Leary was soon to be a fugitive.
One shouldn't underestimate the potential dangers of these kind of drugs, particularly if one is not prepared to take them, if it's not being supervised properly. But on the other hand, I think there was also a journalistic exaggeration of the dangers of these drugs. There were things that were said about them that are blatantly untrue, such as that LSD causes chromosome damage. The Army documents state very clearly LSD causes less chromosome damage than caffeine. That's a direct quote from these documents.
When the psychedelic movement started to emerge in the 1960s, a very conservative America blamed on psychedelics the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. It's so easy to blame it on a substance. If all we just do is stamp it out, we'll be healthy.
The psychedelics are lumped with marijuana and heroin and cocaine in the category of bad drugs. And then there are the drugs we promote, alcohol and tobacco and various forms of caffeine and medically used uppers and downers. And, we don't even see often that they're drugs. And the irony is that that category often has much more dangerous physical effects, much higher potential for addiction.
With psychedelic work,
At leading American universities, researchers are reconsidering hallucinogens to treat mental disorders, alcoholism, and to aid the dying.
I do think that these plants and the chemicals in them have a potential to show people possibilities that are more optimistic and freeing than, we see in our ordinary reality. And, maybe it's no coincidence they appeared at this phase in human evolution when civilization seems to be in such crisis and heading so rapidly toward destruction.
In 2006, the discoverer of LSD celebrated his 100th birthday. Colleagues from all over the world came to Switzerland to honor Albert Hoffman, another reluctant father of the psychedelic era, who called LSD my problem child. Schultes never understood the hippie era. When William Burroughs described his Yahe trip as earth-shattering, Schultes replied, "That's funny, Bill. All I saw were colors." Schultes passed away in 2001 at the age of 86. Today he is celebrated as the greatest Amazonian plant explorer of the 20th century. He described the medicinal use of 2,000 plants previously unknown to science. 120 species bear his name, including a plant for treating ulcers, and another for curing conjunctivitis. A cockroach is named for Schultes. So is a mountain, and 2.2 million acres of protected rainforest. Before the world knew the word rainforest, Schultes warned it was vanishing. and worse. The Indian people and their knowledge, he wrote, are disappearing even faster than the plants themselves. A Brazilian botanist estimates that less than 1% of the Amazon's plants have been studied for their medical potential.
You know, I don't know if the world will ever see the likes of Richard Evans Schultes again. A man of such dedication, able to spend and wanting to spend years in the forest. But I do know that the example of his work, the inspiration of his spirit, will live on to fire the imagination of countless hundreds of scholars and seekers who will never forget his legacy.